Just recently, they verified the Shroud of Turin, atomic, to leave almost like a photographic imprint on a piece of cloth.
Pull the Shroud of Turin up. It's wild to look at. It's so interesting.
And you can see he was completely scourged all over his body. He was crucified.
If there's one religious artifact that embodies pure mystery, it's the Shroud of Turin. For centuries, people have debated whether it's the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ or an elaborate medieval forgery.
An archaeologist who I knew who actually translated the Passion into Aramaic told me that if you look close, you can see the image of a Tiberius coin marks on the eyes. Now, I don't know if that's real or not. I've never actually checked that.
But recently, Mel Gibson stepped into this ancient debate and said something that got everyone's attention. So what's really going on with the Shroud of Turin? And what was Gibson's shocking conviction about it? Stay tuned for this juice. Mel Gibson is one of Hollywood's most controversial figures. He rose to fame in the 1980s with the Mad Max films and became a global superstar with the Lethal Weapon series. In 1995, he won 2 Oscars for directing Braveheart. Then, in 2004, he financed and directed The Passion of the Christ, one of the highest-grossing religious films ever made. He is known to be a devout traditionalist Catholic who built his own church and follows pre-Vatican II practices. His career nearly ended after a 2006 DUI arrest, where he made anti-Semitic remarks, and leaked recordings in 2010 revealed racist language. But recently, Gibson stepped into another controversy when he appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast and made a shocking claim about the Shroud of Turin that got everyone talking. Mel Gibson enters the conversation. In January 2025, Mel Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan for one of those podcast episodes that gets people talking. The conversation went all over the place like Rogan's podcasts usually do. They talked about movies, Hollywood, faith, and eventually landed on the Shroud of Turin. That's when things got interesting. Gibson told Rogan that the shroud has been recently verified as authentic. He talked about new scientific findings that he said prove it's real. He suggested that there's been a cover-up, that important information has been suppressed, and that people are being lied to about what the evidence actually shows. He laid out his case like someone who had studied the research and come to a definite conclusion. Rogan listened and asked questions while Gibson kept going, explaining details about the testing, the image, and why he believes the mainstream narrative about it being a medieval fake is wrong. But why does Mel Gibson care so much about the Shroud of Turin? The answer starts with his faith. Gibson is a devout traditionalist Catholic, not just a regular Catholic who goes to Mass on Sundays. He's part of a movement that rejects the reforms of Vatican II, the major changes the Catholic Church made in the 1960s. Traditionalists believe the Church went off track with those reforms, and they want to go back to the old ways, the old Latin Mass, the old rituals, the stricter interpretations of doctrine. Gibson's father, Hutton Gibson, held extreme traditionalist views and raised his children in that environment. Mel absorbed a lot of that. As an adult, he took his faith so seriously that he built his own church in Agoura Hills, California. The actual name of the church is Church of the Holy Family, Agoura Hills, and it follows the Tridentine Mass, the pre-Vatican II forms of worship conducted entirely in Latin. Most Catholics don't go that far. Gibson did. His faith isn't just personal, it's shaped his career. Taking a closer look at what he did with The Passion of the Christ, a film that depicted the final 12 hours of Jesus' life in graphic, brutal detail, it was quite apparent how much his faith had defined him. No major studio would touch it because they thought it was too controversial and wouldn't make money. Gibson financed it himself with $30 million of his own money. The film was shot in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew with subtitles. It was violent, intense, and unapologetically religious critics accused it of being anti-Semitic. Some religious groups protested, but the film became a massive hit. making over $600 million worldwide. It connected with audiences in a way that shocked Hollywood. Gibson proved that there was a huge audience hungry for serious religious content. The film also made him incredibly wealthy and cemented his reputation as someone willing to put his beliefs on screen no matter what anyone said. For someone like Gibson, the Shroud of Turin isn't just an interesting historical artifact. It's potential proof of the resurrection. If the shroud is real, if it truly is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, then it validates the central miracle of Christianity. It's physical evidence that Jesus was crucified, died, and something extraordinary happened to his body that left an image on the cloth. That's not just important to believers, that's world-changing. Gibson understands that proving the shroud is authentic would be one of the biggest discoveries in human history. It would shift the debate about Christianity from faith alone to faith backed by tangible evidence. That's why he's so passionate about it. That's why he went on Rogan's podcast and said what he said. But not everyone took Gibson's claims seriously. The backlash started almost immediately after clips from the podcast started circulating online. Skeptics pointed out the obvious. Gibson isn't a scientist. He's an actor and director with strong religious beliefs. That doesn't make him qualified to declare that a 2,000-year-old cloth has been verified as authentic. Some critics said he's just promoting his religious agenda. They argued that Gibson wants the shroud to be real so badly that he's willing to ignore evidence that contradicts his beliefs. Others brought up his history of controversial statements. Gibson's past includes a 2006 DUI arrest where he made anti-Semitic remarks, and leaked recordings from 2010 where he used racist language. Those incidents damaged his reputation, and some people saw his shroud claims as another example of him pushing extreme views. Critics also argued that Gibson is cherry-picking evidence. They said he's focusing on the studies and researchers that support authenticity while ignoring the majority of scientists who still believe it's medieval. That's confirmation bias. You look for information that supports what you already believe and dismiss everything else. The phrase, "they're lying to you," got picked up by conspiracy-oriented websites and turned into clickbait headlines. Suddenly it wasn't just Gibson discussing the shroud on a podcast, it was Mel Gibson exposing a massive cover-up. The dramatic framing made it sound like Gibson had uncovered some secret plot, which wasn't really what happened. The conversation was more nuanced than that, but nuance doesn't drive clicks. Still, Gibson wasn't completely wrong about everything. There is legitimate scientific debate about the 1988 carbon dating test. That test, conducted by 3 laboratories, dated the shroud to between 1260 and 1390 AD. For years, that was treated as the final word. The shroud was medieval. But researchers have raised valid questions about that test. The sample was taken from one corner of the cloth, an area that had been handled more than any other part over centuries. Medieval nuns repaired the shroud after a fire in 1532, and some scientists believe the sample may have included fibers from those repairs, rather than the original cloth. Contamination from smoke, oils, and handling could have skewed the results. Carbon dating requires clean samples, and the shroud has been through a lot. There are researchers, credible ones, who believe the shroud is authentic. They've found pollen on the cloth from plants native to Jerusalem. They've identified bloodstains that test as real human blood. They've analysed the weaving pattern and found it consistent with first-century textiles from the Middle East. They've pointed out that the wounds and blood flow patterns are medically accurate for crucifixion in ways a medieval forger wouldn't have known. The image formation process remains unexplained. Nobody has been able to fully reproduce the image using medieval or modern techniques. It's not paint, it's not dye, it only affects the surface fibers of the cloth. Some researchers have proposed that a burst of radiation created the image, possibly from the resurrection itself. That's speculation, but the fact remains that we don't have a definitive explanation for how the image got there. New technologies have revealed details that challenge the medieval forgery theory. Advanced imaging techniques have shown features that weren't visible before. Some recent studies have suggested different dates for the cloth, pushing it back closer to the 1st century. The debate is far from settled, but here's where Gibson's claims get questionable. Saying the shroud has been recently verified overstates the case. Verification would mean scientific consensus. It would mean the majority of experts agree it's authentic. That hasn't happened. The scientific community is still divided. Some researchers believe it's real. Many others don't. New evidence has emerged, but it hasn't been enough to overturn the mainstream view. The phrase "lying to you" suggests intentional deception. It implies that scientists and institutions know the truth but are hiding it for some reason. That's conspiracy thinking. The reality is more complicated. There's ongoing scientific debate. Different researchers look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. That's how science works. It's messy and slow and doesn't always give clear answers. Gibson's certainty comes from his faith, not from scientific consensus. He wants to believe the shroud is real because it would validate his deepest beliefs. That's understandable, but wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. And presenting contested research as settled fact misleads people who don't know the full story. The conversation Gibson started on Rogan's podcast did one thing for sure. It got people talking about the shroud again. It brought attention to research that many people didn't know existed. Whether that's a good thing depends on how you look at it. If it leads to more rigorous scientific investigation, that's positive. If it just feeds conspiracy theories and deepens divisions between believers and skeptics, that's less helpful. Gibson believes he's telling the truth that's been hidden. His critics believe he's pushing faith as fact. Both sides have their points. What's clear is that the Shroud of Turin remains one of history's most compelling mysteries, and Mel Gibson just made sure more people are paying attention to it. But why does this Shroud of Turin hold so much mystery? Let's keep diving. The Shroud of Turin. If you walk into the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, you'll find one of the most debated objects in human history. It's a piece of linen cloth about 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. Though the fabric was aged and yellowed, a closer inspection reveals a faint brownish image of a man. The imprint shows both the front and back of the figure, suggesting the cloth was once wrapped entirely around a body. The image shows a bearded man who appears to have been tortured and killed. There are wounds all over the body. Marks on the head that look like they came from thorns. Wounds in the wrists and feet where nails might have gone through. A gash in the side. Marks across the back that suggest whipping. Everything about this image matches the biblical description of what happened to Jesus Christ during his crucifixion. That's why millions of people believe this cloth is the actual burial shroud of Jesus. That's also why millions of others think it's one of the greatest fakes ever created. The shroud first showed up in recorded history around the 1350s in a small town in France called Liry. A French knight named Geoffroy de Charny claimed to own it, though nobody knows how he got it. From there, it changed hands several times, eventually ending up in the possession of the House of Savoy, an Italian royal family. They moved it to Turin in 1578, and it's been there ever since. The Catholic Church has never officially declared the shroud authentic or fake. They've walked a careful line for centuries. Popes have venerated it. They've allowed it to be displayed to the public, but they've never said this is definitely the burial cloth of Jesus. They call it an object of devotion and leave the question of authenticity open. That ambiguity has kept the debate alive for hundreds of years. Over the centuries, millions of pilgrims have traveled to Turin to see the shroud. It's not on display all the time. The church only brings it out for special exhibitions every few decades. When they do, crowds pack into the cathedral. people wait in line for hours just to spend a few seconds looking at it. For believers, being in the presence of the cloth that might have touched Jesus is a profound spiritual experience. So why do so many people believe it's real? The wounds are the first reason. Every injury visible on the shroud matches what the Bible says happened to Jesus. The Gospel accounts describe Jesus being crowned with thorns, whipped, nailed to a cross, and pierced in the side with a spear. The image on the shroud shows all of that. The thorns left marks around the head. The whipping left dozens of small wounds across the back and legs. The nails went through the wrists and feet. The spear created a large wound between the ribs. Medieval artists painted crucifixions all the time, but they usually got details wrong. They put the nails through the palms of Jesus' hands because that's what people expected to see. But bodies don't stay on crosses if you nail through the palms. The weight of the body would rip through the flesh. Real crucifixions use the wrists because the bones there could support the weight. The shroud shows wounds in the wrists, not the palms. That's anatomically correct in a way most medieval artists wouldn't have known. Then there's the photographic negative issue. In 1898, an Italian photographer named Secondo Pia was allowed to photograph the shroud for the first time. When he developed the glass plate negatives in his darkroom, he nearly dropped them in shock. The negative image revealed far more detail than anyone could see with the naked eye. The face became clear. The wounds stood out. The proportions of the body made sense. Here's the thing. A photographic negative reverses light and dark. What's dark in the original becomes light in the negative. The shroud image is already negative. When you photograph it and reverse the tones, you get a positive image that looks like a real person. This stunned people in 1898 because photography had only been invented in the 1800s. If someone created this cloth in medieval times, how would they have known to create a negative image? They wouldn't have understood the concept photography didn't exist yet. That discovery turned the shroud from a religious curiosity into a scientific puzzle. If it's a fake, how did someone in the Middle Ages create a perfect photographic negative centuries before photography was invented? In 1988, the most famous test ever done on the shroud took place. The Catholic Church allowed scientists to cut a small sample from one corner of the cloth and send it to 3 different laboratories for carbon dating. The labs were at Oxford University in England, the University of Arizona in Tucson, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Carbon dating measures the decay of carbon-14 in organic material to determine how old it is. It's one of the most reliable dating methods science has. All 3 labs came back with the same result. The cloth dated to between 1260 and 1390 AD. That would make it medieval, created roughly 1,300 years after Jesus died. If that date is correct, the shroud can't be authentic. It would have been made during the same period it first appeared in historical records in France. The timing would match perfectly with it being a forgery. The results were published in the prestigious journal Nature. Most scientists and skeptics accepted them as the final word. The shroud was a fake. The Vatican didn't dispute the results publicly. They simply said the Church's reverence for the shroud wasn't dependent on its age. That should have meant the case closed, but almost immediately, questions started popping up about the 1988 test. This is because it was discovered that every time the shroud was displayed or moved, people touched that edge. Whether it was oils from human hands or smoke from candles, dust or dirt, they all contaminated that area more than any other part of the cloth. And carbon dating needs clean samples. So if the sample was contaminated, the date could be wrong. This was the suspicion and case of those who didn't agree with the result of the carbon dating test. And while that debate was happening, other researchers were finding evidence that suggested authenticity. Pollen analysis became one of the most interesting pieces of the puzzle. A Swiss criminologist named Max Frey studied dust and pollen samples from the shroud in the 1970s and 1980s. He identified pollen from plants that grow in Israel and the Middle East. Some of these plants only bloom in spring, which matches the timeline of Jesus' crucifixion during Passover. But then there are the skeptics who put it out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, contested carbon dating, and pollen samples aren't enough. The burden of proof is on the people claiming it's authentic, and they haven't met that burden yet. They also reminded us that medieval Europe overflowed with forged relics. Churches profited from pilgrims eager to see supposed holy objects, from pieces of the true cross to saints' blood and apostle bones. With so much money at stake, creating a fake burial cloth of Jesus would have been a lucrative temptation. To them, the shroud debate is simply faith outweighing evidence. Whenever science points to fraud, believers dismiss the findings and cling to the hope that the shroud is real. Regardless, the Shroud of Turin sits in that cathedral in Italy, still mysterious, still debated. When believers see it, they see evidence of a miracle. When skeptics see it, they see a medieval forgery that's stumped modern science. Both sides have their points. Both sides have their evidence. Yet, even after nearly 700 years of debate, nobody has definitively proven their own side of the coin. What are your thoughts towards Gibson's contribution to this debate? Let's know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more stories. We'll see you in the next video.